And let's just get to it. Please let me know if you can see the screen. Okay, perfect. I'm going to talk about the importance of context, and we will just take a look at some of the biases that we encounter, and we will have a kind of application of these in the classroom. So without any further ado, let's just get started. This is just to refresh your memory. I know that you all know these kind of things, but the idea of context in the language teaching is answering some questions like who, where, what, and why. The reason that we ask these questions is because we want to kind of guide the learners into understanding the meaning or possible meanings in the language that we are learning. So there is a reason that we call it meanings as plural, because it is possible that for example, there are different layers of meaning, or it is possible that we are the intention is more than one meaning. So one of the things about the context is, if you remove the context from the language teaching, is that the language will be ambiguous, and that is not something that we aim for as teachers. The ambiguity is something that we are usually not going for. But at the same time, that is the part that makes the language interesting for more advanced learners, let's say. That is the part that they understand the humor, the jokes, or the different features of the language. So context has a very, very important role. But without it, the students will be kind of lost. Very quickly, we will go over some of the ideas presented about this topic. For example, the idea of scripts, or you can call it scenarios, for example, that was presented in, let's say, 1977. The reason behind these scripts was that they are predictable. They follow these stereotyped patterns, and the most important part, I think now that we can focus on that side, actually, now that we are in 2021, actually, that they form expectations about the sequence and manner, reducing workload of the real-time processing of a speech, which we can call it cognitive load these days. So the whole point of these scripts or scenarios was giving the students a kind of path to follow, because we didn't want to increase the cognitive load. But then, of course, there was this criticism against this kind of approach, because they believe that it is a kind of reductionist approach. And this is considering language just as a language to fill the gaps, or matching situation X to scenario Y, for example, or issues like that. So that was the criticism. Then it was suggested that we need to take a step back from all of this. And then there was the idea of the social part or social aspect of the language. And of course, then we had these four components of effective communication and speaking, mostly, that they were grammatical, discourse, strategic, and social linguistic. To save time, I won't go into details of this. I am sure you know them. Just very briefly, for example, for grammatical component, the competence, they should know that what kind of words or vocabulary or syntax they are going to use. For discourse, which is related to the context, they need to have this understanding of a bigger context, let's say, and for the strategic one, how to compensate conversation breakdowns or communication breakdowns and so on. And for the social linguistic ones, again, that is where context comes in. Is it appropriate to say that, in which context they are talking, and so on. So then we have these contextual factors focusing on the relationships that we have among the students. And of course, one of the key, very detailed areas here was the idea of politeness, which is a nice thing actually to think about. That when we are talking about politeness, is it just something about the language that they are using, or is it something beyond that? Is it related to social linguistic part of that skill, let's say, or it is just the poor use of language? Then, so we have these ideas about the context, the importance of context. And then we go to this side of the story, which is about, let's say, brain side of the story and what cognitive biases are. Let's make it very clear here that when when we are talking about biases, I mean, I think 99% of people, when they hear the word bias, they have this negative attitude about bias because they think that bias is something negative or something that shouldn't be there. But that is a totally natural part of the mechanism that your brain actually takes to compensate for a lot of things. One of them is speed, for example. And this is the part of the brain that has been evolved through centuries to let our species to communicate with the environment better. So cognitive biases alongside with other kind of biases, like cultural biases is one of them, for example, or other biases. What we are focusing on cognitive biases are the systematic pattern of deviation from norm or rationality, which is going to lead to something that we call it irrational at the end. So that is the point that maybe a lot of people think of this as something negative. But again, when you take a look at the history of, I mean, the reasons behind this development of biases in the human brain, you can say that it is for simplifying information, processing and making sense of the world, making decisions better, or let's say faster, because that was something that we needed to do as human beings, let's say. So this is just cognitive biases definition, let's say. But something that amazes me is how many of them we have actually. So if you just Google this codex of cognitive biases, that is super perfectly organized, let's say. This is more than 180 biases, but that's not all of them. That is the point actually. So it is perfect. It's this, let's say, organizations of the ideas is perfect. And so 4 of the biases that I'm going to talk about today are on this codex actually. So you can just take a look at this later. Just Google cognitive biases codex and you will find this page, which is very nice to look at. And I couldn't actually leave this out of the presentation because it's something very nice. So we talked about context in general. We talked about the definition of cognitive biases. So we'll take a look at 4 of the biases. And there is a reason that I chose these 4 actually. One of them, or the first one, is the framing effect. And framing effect is, as you can say, the key word here is the same information presented differently. So everything is the same. So if you take a look at this picture as a famous example of framing effect in marketing, for example, you can see that one of them is 20% fat and the other one is 80% fat-free. So you can see that the information is the same. It's just how you are presenting that information or framing that information that makes the difference. And it has been proven that we have a tendency to go to, let's say, positive words or positive framings or higher numbers. We have different kinds of framing effects. I think we won't have time to go into details of them, but very briefly, for example, the auditory one is about the tone. Again, let's not forget that the information is the same. It means just you're just saying the same thing, but with a different tone. So that is the auditory framing. Or we have the visual one, like the color, like the font size, like the font style, for example, or the value, like that is better, or that is, for example, especially in marketing, that comes in handy, for example, when you say it is 2% off or it is $120 off. That is the value framing of this, the same information again. And the positive, negative, for a famous example of that would be, this is your last chance to buy something, for example. So when you have this last chance kind, it has a kind of effect on the brain or the process of decision making. In terms of language environment, and the reason that I chose that, just think about the framing effect that the learners already has in a new environment, new context of learning language, and your role as a teacher when you're, for example, giving feedback. The information is the same, but knowing that the student has already this bias installed in the brain may change some of the approaches that you take, for example, in the production or the feedback. The other one is the famous confirmation bias. I think everyone knows about that. That is one of the most famous biases, actually, that you try to look for the information that confirms with your theory. But the interesting point, or the point that I find amazing, is actually in this definition, that it is not just the tendency to look for it. The interesting part is the last part, even recalling the information. It means that is the trick that your memory can play actually on you. When you want to confirm something, you can actually distort the memories. So that is something that you have already in your brain, or it's one of the mechanisms that you already have in the brain. I think it is very clear in this diagram that this is your ideas or your beliefs, and these are the facts and evidence. Of course, you prefer the middle one that confirms your ideas, and you're ignoring the ones that don't. And I think that the other parts are, I covered them, like selecting the information that you want, ignoring the information that contradicts with your theory, let's say, or different kinds of manifestations of confirmation bias, like the polarizations of the belief perseverance, for example. That is something interesting because you see that almost every day. That the belief perseverance, or it's when your ideas is actually disproved, but you continue to hold on your idea. So that is a kind of bias that you won't let it go. I mean, when I say you, it is your brain, because your brain actually prefers to hold on something that is more comfortable, let's say. Or the illusionary correlation, for example, just as an example, that finding relationship where there is no relationship because you want just to prove your theory, for example, or you want to just prove a point, let's say, in an argument. The other one is the negativity bias. Is another bias that we are going to talk about. Is, I think this picture sums it up. It's actually the tendency that the negative information has more value or more weight than all of the positive information combined, let's say. So I won't go into detail. I'll just give you an example that, for example, you're having a great day, everything is going great, everything is perfect. But for example, you spill some coffee on your shirt, and from that moment on, you call that day a terrible day. That is your brain focusing on one negative incident instead of looking at the bigger picture of a series of positive things that happened during that day, for example. Then we have these details that probably, I won't go into details to save some time here, but again, we have these details about this negative potency, the negative gradients, negative dominance, negative differentiations, and so on. For example, the dominance is when you have, again, of equal importance, your brain focuses on something negative. And this is not a disorder or something, it's just something that happens in your brain. And the other one is the pessimism bias, which is mostly about thinking about the future or even the present situations. Let's say the famous example of the glass half empty or half full, and that is your tendency to consider something, the possibility of something negative to happen, let's say higher than something positive. That is a defense mechanism against disappointment, because a lot of people do that because they're saying, okay, we go with this scenario that everything, the worst case scenario will happen. And if it happens, we won't lose anything because we are already ready for that. And if not, we will be surprised in a good way. That is a kind of defense mechanism that people, or the brain actually uses. It can be the result of the depression and anxiety. There is a debate going on that is this a cause or an effect of something. So that is just something to think about. And it is different from skepticism, because skepticism is being impartial to the stories, but pessimism bias is actually you're choosing which side you want to go. So we talked about 4 of the biases here: the confirmation bias, the framing effect, the negativity bias, and the pessimism bias. All of them have important roles in language learning. Just put yourself in your student's shoes, for example, that they are experiencing something new in let's say a new language in a new context. If we go, for example, I talked about framing effect in the language, let's say, classroom situation, and the other one, for example, about the negativity bias, focusing on something that, focusing on the negative thing. For example, if the students are focusing on their mistakes and they are ignoring all of the achievements and improvements they have been achieving throughout the semester or throughout the course, but they're just focusing on their mistake, which is going to lead to a kind of lower self-confidence or disengagement. Or the pessimism, that they have this idea that we will never learn this language, or we will never achieve that higher level of language. That is a kind of bias that you can actually approach. Or the confirmation bias, they are full of biases like this. For example, they say they have some preconceived ideas that, for example, if I do this, this happens, everyone will laugh at me. And as soon as you smile, they interpret that, for example, as a kind of you are laughing at them or something like that. So that is something that we can actually pay more attention to, let's say. So we talked about context, we talked about cognitive biases, and we talked about we are going to talk about the important role of culture, because in terms of anthropology and sociology researchers, they say that unless you have this connection to this community, or unless you have the definition of true self in a community, you won't form a meaningful relationship. Hence, you won't have meaningful, let's say, interactions. And that is something that we actually want from the students. So that is the place that culture, that is the part that culture plays. So you can see that when we say culture, it is actually very much the same as context, because it's a kind of context that we are dealing with in terms of language teaching. So these 3 C's are very important here. This is just a suggestion. This is something that I've been doing, and I got I got a lot of positive, let's say, feedback from this. So what can we do as teachers in the classroom? I know that all of us set the context, and that is something that we do whenever we want to plan a lesson. So we pay attention to a lot of different forms of context, like the linguistic context or whatever. But here we are talking about the role of cultural context, or let's say that the bigger context, whatever you call it, but I'm just picturing the image that it is a bigger context. The point is, if you assign roles to the learners in this new context, what happens in terms of their brain encountering a new context? So they are not themselves anymore. They have the new roles in the new context. That goes like the scripts that we talked about, or the scenarios that we for example, a very classic example is that they are, I don't know, in a hotel, and one of them is a hotel manager, the other one is a guest, something like that, as easy as that. So they have these roles, but the point is not them acting out the roles. The point is what happens in their brain when they are into the character, in the character of the new role. Do they have the same level of biases, for example, when they are accepting this new role, that they are not, for example, an 18-year-old, let's say, for example, Japanese student or a Turkish student in my context. Now they are, for example, a 50-year-old hotel receptionist. What happens in their brain in terms of biases? Do they see the world the same as they see as an 18-year-old person, for example? Or can we even touch on those areas, or does it have any effect on us? So the point is having them believing or accepting there's these new roles. This, we are actually cherry picking some of the positive things about the idea of scripts, because we know that that is not something that is perfect. So we are just using the parts that we can use, for example. So they don't need to go through the process of living in a new culture to internalize everything. They have this, let's say, scenario, and they accepted their new roles. Let's say that their brain is fresh in this scenario. It is impossible to be biologically fresh at all time, but it is kind of, we can hope for that it is less biased in that scenario, for example. Then they have this, we can hope for the lower effects of the bias. And so a combination of things happen here. So one of the things that happens is we still have that reduced cognitive load. We are aiming for reduced effect of biases. And now we are aiming for example, something that they feel more comfortable, they have more confidence in, because they are experiencing a new role in this scenario, let's say. The whole point of this and all of this is because it was written in one of the papers that I was reading, actually, that you can train your brain. That is something that you can actually work on. It doesn't happen overnight, of course. It doesn't work like this, that it is not going to, let's say, disappear magically, but you can be more aware of the mechanisms that your brain is actually, let's say, using to adapt to the new situation, and know how to handle them. And the students or the learners can know that by repeating this information. So I thought that by putting them in the new context, by reducing the negative sides of the biases, and again, there are positive sides to the biases, no one is denying that, but we are focusing on reducing the negative sides of that. By reducing the cognitive load, by giving them a sense that they have this connection to other members of the, let's say, community, we can actually hope for a better, let's say, outcome or a smoother transition, let's call it. So we don't know, we never know what happens actually. So that's it actually. I found these connections amazing when I was thinking about this presentation, and I thought that it won't hurt if more teachers are aware of these, let's say, mechanisms, the natural mechanisms, and definitely won't hurt if learners know about this, because then they won't think of these kind of things that, oh, there's something wrong with me, for example, as a learner, because they can feel that this is something that they can actually benefit from. So that's it. I have no idea how much time we have left, but I think we have time for some, let's say, sharing ideas or what you think about these ideas or the connections that I made. Please unmute yourself and just share your ideas.
Mohammed, I put the cognitive bias codex into the chat even before you said it.
Perfect. I couldn't check the chat box because I was going through the screen. So yeah, but now I am checking it. Perfect. Yeah, it's a very nice one. It's a very nice organization of the information. I really loved it. So thank you.
I think you have to know that you have to start on the outside at the 4 big topics and then work inwards to really understand it. Yeah, it is beautiful.
It's very easy to follow. It's color coded. It is giving you information that what kind of biases, what is happening. Is it too much information or is it kind of decision making in a short period of time? So that's what I loved about that codex actually. Thank you for sharing that, Curtis. Yep. Okay. If I don't know how much time is left, but if you have any questions, or if you think about something that you have done the same, or do you think do you even think that it is useful to share this information, like, I mean, the general awareness about biases with other teachers or even with learners? Do you think that the learners can benefit from it? Because whenever you mention something in these areas, because I experienced the same thing, whenever I talk about these topics with my colleagues or with the learners, most of the time, the first reaction is panicking, because they think that this is a very kind of, let's say, scientific area to get into. But even knowing that your brain has these biases, or they are already there and they are the natural part of the brain, will help reduce a lot of, let's say, anxiety or any negative feelings that the learner can feel during the learning process. That was my, I don't know, justification when I was thinking about talking about this.
Stephen and I were just talking today about how we're entering an age where this kind of critical thinking or understanding your biases is becoming more and more important. And personally, I'm feeling it on myself.
We need a new word. The word bias has so many negative connotations. We need a new English word that's neutral, because biases are neutral. They're natural. At times they can be abused, at times they're very useful, but bias, the word itself, is not our friend in explaining these things to students and teachers.
Yeah, totally agree. And I think it is, I had this feeling that I can't even do anything to change this connotation, that I've been trying to convince people that it is something not negative, it is something neutral as, I don't know, the hormones of your body or whatever. But I think, as you said, we need a new term, because this term is being overused, I guess. It's too late to save this word.
Like with Howard Gardner's multiple intelligence, let's call them skills. Confirmation skill.
Now that's a positive word. A friend of ours, Joseph Scholz, says biases are totally natural, but so are diseases. It doesn't mean biases are good, just in the same way that diseases are not necessarily good. he's reaching for the right word as well, I think.
Yeah, I remembered listening to him in one of his podcast episodes, exactly targeting this issue that bias is something neutral. So, yeah, I think, yeah, we ran out of time. Yeah, thank you very much for listening. Thank you.
Wow, that was good.
Thank you, Curtis.
I want to hear more. We're not being sent out. I also put a link to You Are Not So Smart, a podcast that talks about mental fallacies and biases. They've got about 200 episodes so far.
Yeah, I know about that podcast actually. Yeah, it's a nice one.
Oh,
we have 7 seconds, I guess, and then we will be out.
Okay.
To her, and the TV came on, and I didn't realize my mic was on, so I'm sorry.
Oh, I've been washing dishes.
Okay, so yeah, I've managed to actually delete the 2 rooms we don't need now, so that should hopefully make it easier for people to rejoin the room they want to go to. So yes,
Caroline, there was a great white noise during my presentation.
I have to apologize. That was from my computer. I'm sorry. I had to go to the kitchen and I forgot to mute. I'm sorry.
Okay.
So, yeah, sorry, I didn't catch it soon enough, but as soon as I came in, I did